out this next panel, I have the pleasure of introducing two very fabulous and highly accomplished leaders who are making their mark in a traditionally male-dominated field. Lindsay Verstegen is the Chief People and Diversity Officer at the Detroit Lions. For more than a decade, Lindsay has been helping scale organizations and championing winning cultures in technology. And now she's doing that work inside of the NFL in Detroit, leading a quest to build an open, equitable, and transparent organization where everyone feels like they belong. And Ashwini Balasubramanian, who currently serves as General Manager of Advanced Engineering at Harley Davidson. In this role, she leads all aspects of advanced engineering, including test and reliability engineering, core engineering, and innovation teams. Ashwini is also responsible for delivering motorcycle leading innovation and technology roadmaps all across the motorcycle portfolio. So welcome, ladies. Excited for our conversation. We hop on over here. Well, first of all, let's talk about, we know it's difficult surviving and thriving in a male-dominated industry. Let's talk about what are some of the obstacles that you had to overcome early in your career?
So my path to corporate America was very non-traditional. So candidly, a lot of my struggle was because I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I didn't even really major in business. I have a background in performance. I come from a very musical family, but ultimately what I did was I just kind of leaned into where I was curious and figured out that what brought me to theater was this desire to connect people and tell people's stories, and it was really sort of led by my own curiosity in that regard. But what happens when you don't have some of those external validation points is your inner critic can get pretty loud. Because you think, well, geez, I don't, especially in tech, I've worked with a lot of CEOs who go to like the Harvards, the Yales, et cetera, have traditional sort of consulting backgrounds. And so I think a lot of it really, honestly, was a little bit of myself. That was the hardest thing because, again, I didn't have that traditional path. How I found helpful was I found women who believed in me, who saw something in me I didn't see. And I'm really grateful for that every day. But, sadly, the call was coming from inside the house, the hardest thing. And, I think probably a lot of my work over the last couple decades, I'm in a better place with that now, but I think that's the tricky thing, when you don't necessarily know what your path is, but you find your way there.
So very, very similar to you, Lindsay. For me, I went to school in India for my bachelor's. I chose mechanical engineering as my main stream. It's not a very popular stream of engineering for women in India, even today. So I was one of two women in the 4 years of college. So I got very comfortable being around men. So the issue was not actually the men, it was me, right? I got so comfortable. I always had this tendency to fit in, right? I remember coming here to the US, starting to work here, and kind of carrying that same mentality. I was so eager to fit in. Sometimes I'd have to remind the guys in my team and say, hey, I'm still here, you gotta still watch what you're saying, right? And their response would be no, Ashwini, you're a bro, you're not a girl. And I remember feeling so proud of myself. I'm right, I'm fitting in. I think when I had my first child, I kind of got slapped in the head and woken up from my slumber. At that point, I could no longer, it was no longer enough to just fit in. I had to speak my truth because my challenges were different, and I could no longer just survive by fitting in. So I think that was the point where I realized the obstacle was not actually the people around me. It was more intrinsic in my own mind and in my own eagerness to fit in. But what is interesting also is once I stopped trying to fit in and I actually started speaking my mind, my career actually took off. Counterintuitive.
And you two are obviously have overcome those obstacles. Now you're thriving in your respective industries. So tell us, share with us the secret. How do you succeed in a male-dominated industry?
You go first.
Okay.
So for me, I think, like I said, even though I started speaking my truth, I knew that you can't thrive in an environment like that by demonizing the people that are the majority. You have to be able to fight your fight, overcome your obstacles by actually making them understand your point of view. So the first step was to say, okay, I'm not going to behave like a victim here. I'm not going to sit here and brood about what's not going right. You have to be able to find that inner courage to speak about the struggles, not just your own, but the women around you, right? Speak on behalf of them. If you have a seat at the table, it's not just a responsibility for yourself, but for every woman that does not have a seat at that table, so you speak on behalf of them, right? So I think for me, being able to become a partner and finding allies within the workforce was probably the game changer. Because it was never about putting them on the spot for what they were not doing, because I'm a kind of person that always believes in positive intent. I always believe people should come from a place of positive intent. If someone's behaving with a bias, that's because they're not aware. So I feel like it's my responsibility to make them aware of the challenges and maybe the unconscious bias they're displaying. So if you do that in a way where they want to join your fight to help the other women, I think that's success.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would piggyback to say, like, in the same way you talk about not betraying yourself, that also includes, like, I think we had a little call, because I don't know much Amy, now we know each other, and, you know, the first thing I said is, like, do you feel like you're thriving? Like, are we thriving? Okay, great. We are thriving, like, as a whole, the whole is very good, but that doesn't mean it's, like, frolicking in the field every day and feeling like I know exactly where I'm going today. But I think, you know, to your point, you think about, like, motherhood. So I became a mom 7 years ago. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. And, you know, I think that's the thing about motherhood, is because it asks so much of you, and you can no longer just sort of like compensate, right? Because you got nothing left. All the old systems that used to work don't work anymore. And I think, you know, for me it's true, but it's this weird cliff you look over when you realize you can't go back to the person who was super accommodating and pretended everything was okay, but you also are not sure if you can be as courageous as the person who just says what she thinks and doesn't apologize for it. But that is where your power is, but it's a very weird jump to do that. But yes, to your point about thinking about particularly other women, but honestly, I have 2 boys at home. I want to raise them in a world where they feel liberated. They don't feel, you know, constrained by old systems that don't serve us anymore. And so I think that's totally true, is thinking about the younger generation and not doing anything to them that you wouldn't, you know, not putting them in any worse position. And again, going back to the inner critic piece, you know, it often does take centering it in someone else's experience for me to be that brave, right? And I wish that wasn't true. But that's, you know, that's also just, you know, the deal sometimes. So just, you know, thinking more about that. And I also think being authentic, so when you aren't thriving, that the people that maybe haven't had the sort of reps that you've had, understand that when they have a bad day, that doesn't mean they're bad at their job. Doesn't mean like they're on a wrong path or like they're an imposter. People have bad days. Like, to thrive is to get up the next day and try it again anyway. And I remember in particular leading, you know, the HR function through a pandemic, the work of diversity, equity, inclusion through, you know, 2020 and the reckoning that happened then. I remember I used to say every day I wake up, I'm putting my heart on my sleeve, I'm making the best decisions I can. I feel like I'm getting beat up every day, and I rest and I try again the next day. And that was very difficult, because the other piece is we have such a perfection, you know, we'd like to be in control, we'd like everything to look exactly right. To be human is to have all the messy stuff in between. And so I also think authenticity extends to telling women about those hard days, and like not, you know, having this idea that to be perfect is the only way to be, because that's not, you know, that's not authentic leadership. But yeah, that's sort of like looking over the edge and saying, I'm not going to assimilate anymore, is a very weird place to be, but it is where the power is, and doesn't mean it's any less scary.
You both have kind of touched on the next question that I have for you. Ashley, you talked about using your voice, not trying to just fit in, and you talked about being authentic. Do you have any other advice for how to survive in, I mean, the fields that you're in, football and motorcycles, just about as male-dominated as it gets? Any other tips for surviving in those types of environments?
I think it's hard to do, right? When you are in those places, it can be easy to go to a place where you feel isolated and you're just the only one in the room. So there's a lot of that inner critic that comes into play when you're in those situations. But I think if you think about when you are blazing new trails, you're not doing it just for yourself, but for all the women that come after you. I think when you think about all the invisible people that you might not even know, you might never cross paths with, but you're blazing the trail for everybody that comes after you, I think you can find courage there. And I think, for example, I can probably be very specific about this. So I was once in a room where we're talking about performance reviews of the rest of the team, and the men are very focused on two men that are, high performers and heroes and however they like to call them. I'm sitting there and saying, something's wrong with this picture, right? There was a big firefighting project, this person put out the fire and all of that stuff. And I said, should I say this? Should I not say anything here? But then I said, are we rewarding firefighting, or are we not rewarding the person that is silently doing all the work, which happened to be a female, right? So we have this tendency to reward people that display heroics, right? But if we don't look out for the other women around us, I think it becomes harder for them to find the voice at the table as well, right? So the way I have found myself to thrive is when I find the courage to speak up for others, and then I think that brings new perspectives to the discussion overall, right? And because the question I asked was, are we rewarding somebody that had a fire of their own making? And now they're trying to put out that fire, right? Are we rewarding all the women that are silently doing their job? I have yet to meet a woman in the automotive industry, in the transportation space, that does not do a kick-ass job. I'm yet to meet that. Whether you are speaking within your team, whether you are speaking at a bigger forum where leadership is talking about next succession, whatever your role is, speak on behalf of the other women that don't have a seat at the table. I think it's so important because it helps you thrive as well, right? It shows you that you can see beyond the popular vote, the popular opinion, and you're not afraid to speak up, and you can find courage at that point to speak on behalf of yourself as well. Because it's very hard to advocate for yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, what struck me about that story, and I would love for you to be a manager or with me, because that's the sort of stuff like I'm pointing out, like, hey, the hero made themselves the hero in the story. Do we not get that? Okay. But the way that you told it even, and what you said, it's like you're not demonizing them. That's perspective that's lacking because they work in that seat. That does not mean they're bad. And so I think it's so important to, again, lean into what is your perspective, because that's why you're there. I mean, even in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's the belonging piece. It's the people actually feeling like they can say what they gotta say and not do a lot of mental gymnastics, right? Because that is extra work on top of it. So I think that's what struck me in your story, I just wanted to say, because that totally resonated, which is, if you're coming from a place of we are collaborators, we are colleagues, and I see something you don't see, it's also like there's no truth, right? Like we all have our own truth. So even if we come from a place of, we're big on the story I'm telling myself is, and then it's not personal, it's just this is the story I'm telling myself. The story I'm telling myself is you're not recognizing this woman who's preventing the fire, right? You're rewarding this very easy thing, which is, oh, look at this big shiny project. Well, what if we never got in the mess to begin with? And there's where the real work's happening. So I think that, yes, +1.
Well, has it impacted the way that you interact and conduct business? I know you mentioned that they looked at you as one of the bros. I mean, have you had to maybe change your style a little bit, your type of dress to try to, I don't want to say fit in, because we don't want to fit in, like you said, in these male-dominated industries, but has it changed the way that you approach and conduct business?
You believe.
Oh, gosh.
Yes, but I also think the most important work I've done as a leader has been regulating myself. Like going into a day and I meditate in the morning for even just a little bit because I think what's the most important thing is, again, how much are you looking to change or morph to build connection, and how much are you looking to change or morph because you believe you're something that, that you're not what you need to be. The other piece is, in terms of building the relationships, it's so, so important. And so that when that happens, again, it doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like, oh, she's coming with perspective I don't appreciate. Eventually, after a while, you start to make fun of each other for it, right? Like you get in a groove with your leaders of like, oh, that's your thing again. There's that. You're doing your stuff again. But then you get called on it the same way. So I think the biggest thing is everyone is a human being, regardless of their gender, and that you understand what intrinsically motivates them. In fact, in some of my hardest conversations where I feel like I'm not getting anywhere, I will ask, what do you hope people remember about your leadership when they don't work for you anymore? And the number of times people actually don't have the answer for that, I think it's less about, I'm not looking for a perfect answer, I'm just wondering, are they conscious of it, right? And so a leader that comes back to me and has an answer, and it's thoughtful, then I think, oh, okay, they're actually a little bit aware. So for me, I think it's less about morphing, although admittedly, I'm not wearing my Lions gear today, but I got crap from Chris Spielmix. He was like, you work for the Lions, we're Lions stuff. I was like, okay. It's like, that's a totally different arena. So it's like, you're trying to figure it out, like, what are you supposed to do? But I think it's about that healthy balance of whatever you are doing, just make sure you know the reason why you're doing it. I think that's the biggest thing. It's a consciousness thing to me. Anything is totally fair as long as you're aware of why you're doing it and you're not, again, doing mental gymnastics, right? If you're doing a lot of work to try to figure out how to show up, that's less work you can spend on the actual work you're doing. So.
The other thing I've noticed is, this is something I admire about men, right? They are able to look at each other in the eye and give each other critical feedback. Women are usually about, let's build each other up. You go girl, you got this, you do all, which is great. But I think women don't get raw, constructive, unfiltered feedback enough, right? And we need that. We need that. We don't get that enough. So I think for me, what I've found is if I can tap into my male colleagues, right, and tell them you have the permission to give me that raw, unfiltered feedback, it can be game changing, right? Because I've seen men look at each other and say, that presentation really sucked, dude. You gotta do better. I've never seen women say that to each other. Never seen that. But I think I've asked a lot of my male colleagues who have become good friends of mine. I said, you need to tell me if I'm not doing a good job. You have that space, but you have to tell them explicitly because they're worried about giving you raw feedback and then you going into an emotional state, which is okay, that's a different topic.
They're emotional too. Let's be very clear, it just shows up differently. They're as emotional.
Yes. But it's a stereotype, right?
Totally.
It's a stereotype. So I think if you give the male colleagues that work with you the permission to go there, to give you that unfiltered feedback, I found it to be game changing. Like I've probably made the most improvement by receiving that kind of unfiltered feedback. Because sometimes you don't know how you're showing up. You think you're doing a great job, but you don't know how you're showing up when you're in front of a group that doesn't look or behave or think anything like you do. So I think building those allies and giving them that space can be super helpful when you want to thrive in that environment.
And it starts with just, do you have any feedback for me?
Yeah.
It's like not hard, it's just like at the end of it, does that resonate with you? It's just like creating the space for that to come. And at the first, I don't know what your experience has been, but the first like 3 times, nothing will come back. Because it'll be like, wait, are you being serious right now? And then by the 4th time, actually stuff comes back. And then the other piece is that when I offer feedback, it's not like I'm doing something I'm not willing, I'm not making them go through something I'm not willing to do. And I say to them at the end of the day, all this can make total sense on paper, but if it doesn't make sense to you, what am I doing here? And so I think it's a small thing, but just again, creating the space. That said, it's gonna feel a little scary the first time.
It is.
You're like sitting there in silence, like, am I really ready? But I think to just know I'm gonna do it until I get something back because it's good for me to do that.
And it's been helpful even with performance review discussions, right? Because like I go in there, and sometimes my bosses think it's really weird. Because I'll go in there and it's like, what do you want me to work on? And what do you want me to work on? And they're like, let me tell you the good stuff. I said, good stuff comes later. You first tell me what I need to work on. 2 reasons. One, when I want to leave the meeting, I want to feel good. So I want to hear the good stuff towards the end. And the second reason, I want to understand the the unfiltered feedback first, right? And I think when you prioritize and you give them that space, they feel more comfortable as well because they feel like you're in that mindset to receive that feedback and they're not afraid of, you know, and I have heard this from other male colleagues, like we have a lot of focus on D&I, which is great. I think that's the right dialogue to have, but they have gone, some of them have gone into the space where they're not sure what they can say and what they cannot say. They have this fear, right? So sometimes, even though the onus is on us, and it's not fair, but we have to give them that permission to go there and give us that kind of feedback.
Yeah, I agree, that feedback is so important, whether you get the good or the bad, as you said.
Well, probably in your line of work, you get it, right? From a producer or something. And
too, yeah.
yes, but this is what it looks bad. No, but that's the thing actually that's funny about my background in theater, is I was very used to getting feedback on things that were very personal. Like about the way my neck looked in a scene, you know? Like, I'm like, oh, okay, like, it's really personal. So now you can give me feedback on my feedback training, I don't care, like, that's not my thing. That's just how it works. So I think in some ways, like, again, like the repetition, eventually it's just part of how you work, it's how you operate. It's so helpful.
Be very, very helpful. You ladies are both bringing a lot to the table, obviously. There are a lot of strengths as a woman. How do you use those differences in these male-dominated industries in a positive way?
I feel like I was brought to the organization for my difference, right? I'm not coming from the world of sports. The Lions knew they needed an outsider voice, somebody to ask questions that maybe had been either not been asked or had been asked, but it's like, well, that's just not how we do it. And that's not just even specific to the Lions, it's the NFL in general. So I think like the thing that I have said to myself every day is they've hired me for me, and that means, you know, people in the, you know, I say they know my stuff too. There are certain words I use that they think are so funny because I'm not from the football world. Like, I can't even tell you, like, I'll say, well, should you do this cohort of learning? Or, oh, there she goes, like, using cohort again. And I'm like, it's not that weird, get out of your bubble. But it's like that sort of thing is the difference. And what I notice is the difference is actually what inspires their own reflection on how they've been showing up. It's a very strange thing to realize that your difference is, you know, why you're there. Because as human beings, we would like to be liked, you know. And I set a personal goal for myself even before I joined the Lions. I said, this is the year I'm going to care less about being liked. And ask me how I'm doing on that. Better, but I'm still tough, because what I tell myself is like, we are animals at the end of the day who want to feel like part of the tribe, who want to feel like we're part of the group. And so, you know, I think sometimes just acknowledge, like, you are just being a human being. There's no shame in that game. But that also means that when you bring your difference, it's going to feel a little funny. And so to just be aware of that, not beat yourself up about it, and really know that your difference is why you're there. Because by the way, any of these products we're talking about, motorcycles, football, sports, etc., they are built for women too. That's it. I remember my first aha in DEI was Groupon in 2011. They put up the consumer demographics. It was like, you know, 90% of the people buying Groupons are women. Isn't this amazing? And now we're going to do Q&A. And out marched an entirely male white leadership team. And I was like, that's messed up. It's like, who's making the decisions for the people that are buying this? So anyway, you know, these are traditionally male avenues, but we want everyone in the game of football. You know, you want women to be riding motorcycles, and at the end of the day, that is why your difference matters, is because you're building products that still remain living, breathing, evolving products that need to invite more people to use them.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Lindsay. The other thing I find is when you're maybe the first female to be in a certain position, you're the only one in that position, there's a tendency for people to say, oh, well, now we're focusing on DE&I. She's a diversity quota woman, that's why she's there. You know, initially I used to be really bothered about it, but now I'm like, I don't really care. You're entitled to your opinion. This is a free land, you can talk whatever you want. But I think what happens is you have to give yourself the grace and be okay with people having that kind of chatter. Because eventually when you perform, like I said, women are kick-ass at their job. When you perform, all that chatter quietens down and dies on its own. right? It's very hard to go and justify yourself with everybody that's creating that chatter because you don't know who those people are. And when you bring the diverse voices to the table, I think what really happens is it changes the way the product evolves. So for example, before coming to Harley, I worked in automotive for about 20 years. And when I worked at Toyota, this is the Toyota Venza. I don't know how many of you have heard of this vehicle. It's just made its re-entry back into the market, which I'm so excited about. But this vehicle came off the prototype line. And the prototype line, once it's off, all the different engineers are there to check the vehicle and make sure it's okay. And they had this lift gate that opens up, right? So they're like, okay, where are the vertically challenged people? I'm like, right here, right here, you know? So they called me and said, can you try to reach that lift gate for us? There's a button we put, you know, that was the first, I think, one of the early times where you had the button for closing, and I'm like, it's great, but I can't reach it, you know, it's too tall for me. So they actually went back and redesigned the lift gate to have a damper that could lower the, so now in a lot of vehicles you'll see they open up halfway and then you can open them up more. Not that I took any credit for the design, but what I'm trying to say is the diversity of thought and the diversity of experiences that we bring to the table actually makes the products better. Like you said, you know, most of the car purchases, it's a big ticket item, right? When someone purchases a car, a lot of the decision making is influenced by women in the household, right? So I think if you think about how you approach diversity, not just because it's the right thing to do, it is the right thing to do, but also it's good for business because you can expand your customer base. You can improve the satisfaction of your customer base. That's where really diversity gives you the bang for the buck.
This next question is, how did you break down barriers? But I feel like the question is really, how are you continuing to break down barriers? And also, how does it make you feel knowing that, you know, if you're first in the field in your certain job, that you're creating that space for other women eventually to follow in your footsteps, hopefully?
I mean, I think to go back to sort of the previous thing, there are also women inside, you know, the organization who've been with the organization a long time as well. And you know, I also try, you know, we've talked about not demonizing men. It also includes don't demonize women who came up in the patriarchy, right? Who like came up in a system that wasn't for them. And that includes, you know, not just gender, but also race. This is just true. So I think the other piece is like break down barriers by continuing to just see people as they are. And just, you know, I said the story I'm telling myself is, you know, you say like about people will have chatter, but the reality is most of the time you're putting that on it. That's the narrative you're telling yourself. So again, to just say like, okay, that, my coach, my exec coach should say to me, if you're gonna tell yourself a story, tell yourself one you like. Like, instead of chatter, like, oh, they're paying attention to what I'm doing. That's interesting. It's just totally different, right? If you go to bed at night going like, oh, they're paying attention versus they all hate me. It's awful. So to just be really mindful of that internal dialogue, I think. So I think by breaking down barriers, it's the little things, because the way that we either stay in the game or drop out is little things. If it was a big thing, there'd probably be way more of us in this room. But the reality is just pay attention to all those little micro behaviors that you've got internally, and then also for your colleagues, to just see them for like, oh, I wonder what it was that made you feel like that's the way you gotta show up right now. Like, wow, we just came from totally different worlds. So I think just like continue to do the hard work of just connecting as humans. It's not rocket science, but it doesn't mean it isn't hard.
Yeah, for me, I think, you know, I like to tell the story to people that are struggling with understanding why we need to prioritize understanding other people's barriers. But I think, you know, my husband works in the auto industry as well. But when we talk, his experience in the auto industry is very different than mine. Very, very different than mine, right? But I can't go about telling every man in the auto industry what my experiences is hard. But I think when we think about barriers and how we need to break them. So I go back to the actual story I want to say. So I'm assuming everybody's familiar with Zoom, right? Everybody, how many of you have used the raise hand feature on Zoom? We have that on Teams now too, right? If you talk to the owner and founder of Zoom, he tells the story about how Zoom did not have the raise hand feature to begin with. So once the pandemic hit and all the schools and everybody went virtual, his daughter, his 8-year-old daughter came up to him and said, "Dad, if I'm in class, I can raise my hand and ask my teacher a question. I'm not able to do that while I'm doing class through Zoom." He was like, "That's a really good idea." Right? That's a barrier he didn't think about at all, because he was assuming whoever had the loudest voice got the loudest space and the most space in the meeting, right? So he didn't even think about that barrier, and they installed that feature after his daughter came up to him and asked him that question. So I say that story because I think when you talk to people about barriers, it's very hard when you talk in figurative speech, right? It feels like a lot of hand waving when you just talk about, "Well, I have barriers and you don't." And they don't understand it. But when you talk about specific examples like that, people get it, right? They say, "Oh yeah, I would have never thought of that either," right? Because that's not an environment we live in. And I tell them, it's like, my environment is very different than yours. Your lens is very different than mine. So when I come to you with a barrier that I'm facing, it's not because I'm saying you haven't worked hard. I'm just saying that I have to work twice as hard as you to get past that barrier, right? So I think being able to articulate what the difficulties are with real life examples helps actually break down that barrier. And I think it also goes back to me to think about breaking down those barriers, not just for myself, for everybody around me. So I find it easier when I feel like I'm fighting on a lot of other people's behalf and not just self-serving for myself. So I feel like there's a lot of courage that I derive from that as well.
But what you just said also requires being vulnerable, you know, to say like,
Yes.
I have a need,
Yes.
I have
Yes.
a need. That's
Yes.
it. Like, think about how revolutionary that would be if we just owned what we needed. But I still struggle with that. This is what I need. I know it's different than what you need, but this is what I need, you know? So I just want, you know, I think to call out like that, the daughter gave the idea to, because that's her dad, she was comfortable. I'd be curious, like
Yeah,
maybe
there's
someone else
safe
had
space.
that idea, but they just are like, I don't want to say it, you know? So, I mean, it's little revolutionary acts, right? To just own what you need in whatever spaces you're in.
And I think we tell ourselves this narrative of how, you know, we don't want to be disruptive, you know, we want to make sure we're this team player, we want to be cohesive and collaborative, which is all great. These are strengths women have, but sometimes it's okay to be disruptive because it's good for the business as well, right? So if we find that courage to break down that barrier and talk about what is that idea we have in place that we want to talk about, it can be quite disruptive for the business as well. So if you hold back, I think you're doing yourself and the business and the organization a disservice and not bringing your full self to work.
I feel like we could sit here and chat all day. You ladies are so wise. Is there a final piece of advice that you would give our audience?
You go first. You know, it sounds really cheesy, but it is truly revolutionary to be who you are. I mean, we're in a world that really wants us to be something that we're not, usually trying to sell us something or, you know, make us question ourselves. So I really think whether it's through meditation or connecting with other people who feel like you really see you, being really mindful of who you're surrounding yourself with in that regard, just to feel like, you know, you are being wholly authentic is, again, like a little act of revolution I hope everyone takes on.
I love that, Lindsay. I think it is very, very important. The other thing, I'm in no means perfect at this. I'm still working on it, right, is the best advocate and the best sponsor you can find for yourself is you. If you don't advocate and you don't become a sponsor of your own career, your own journey, you're going to have a hard time finding sponsors in others, right? So you have to get comfortable about taking credit for your accomplishments. You have to become comfortable about claiming your space at the table. You know, a friend of mine once told me, if there is no chair at the table, bring a folding chair, but you will find your spot at the table. So I think you have to get comfortable about advocating for yourself, because like, you know, we have a lot of self-doubt, and I was sharing this at the roundtable earlier, is self-doubt is very invisible, right? It only manifests as a lack of self-confidence, and people don't know what to do with it. So if you don't become your own coach, your own advocate, sometimes it's hard for people to pull you up and pull you out of that rabbit hole. Because one, they're busy with their lives, and sometimes they don't know how to help you. So you have to find that inner courage as well. Do we have time for an audience question? No? Yes? Okay. Anybody have a question?
Will we win the Super Bowl?
I feel like either way to answer this is not right.
If we need. I can. She's also the president of AWS, Automotive Alliance Foundation.
Yes.
Thank you. So, how many times have you been on a Harley?
6.
No, seriously. What fascinated you to make the jump from your previous company, which is an automotive supplier, into HD?
Yeah, so when HD approached me in fall of 2021, Harley Davidson, HD short for Harley Davidson. But when they approached me, I actually thought it was a spam call. I didn't believe it was real. And then they followed it up with an email, and then I started having the conversation. What fascinates me the most about Harley is, it's a company with a very unique culture. You walk into the product development center, you will not find anybody that does not wear Harley swag. Not one person, right? Whether they're the CEO, the C-suite, the mechanic, the engineer, the finance person, doesn't matter what role they are in, they all wear only Harley swag. That's the amount of pride the company employees have about the brand. That's the amount of loyalty they have towards the brand. I have never seen anything like that. I've never seen anything like that in automotive. I worked at Toyota for 7 years. My husband works at GM. We either get them for free or we will go buy them if we're supporting the company for an event, right? So I've never seen that kind of brand presence like Harley does. So that brand loyalty is very contagious. Obviously, this is our 120th year, so if anyone's interested, there's a whole lot of activities at Milwaukee that we're planning. But I think for me, the switch really was because of the scope of the role. So when I was approached, I was in a sales and marketing role at a supplier, and this was back to engineering, which is my first love. So that was one big check mark. The second part was this was a much bigger group that I had to manage. There are about 250 people in my department right now. I've never managed a group this large. And then the ability to actually chart the innovation trajectory for an iconic company like Harley, no one can say no to that, But I think for me, I always run towards challenges. If something's going to make me uncomfortable, I'll go head on. It intrigues me. It gives me kind of a high, right? So never having worked for motorcycles, I'm not a rider, and I've never ridden in my life. That piece itself was intriguing, and it was a challenge. I felt like it would keep me uncomfortable for a very long time, and I love that. Right? So that's why I moved Kim.
Hi, this question is for Lindsay. With your theater background and what you're doing today, being an artistic person, do you feel as though you are still receiving the same benefits or like connected to your purpose with what you're doing now? Is it giving you the same rewards?
In a different way, yes. And for a while, I didn't talk about my theater background. I actually was part of starting a theater company that's still in Chicago, just celebrated 15 years. I walked away from it, I got really burnt out. That's just what I go full. I'm like you, I'm like, discomfort, let's go. I also thought the email from the Lions was spam, so good. We have that in common. I was like, what? But it's interesting what you asked because I've thought a lot about, there is this you want to evolve and go toward your purpose and you hope that that's happening. And when I think about why I went to theater, it was to understand ways I was feeling, things that I'd see in other people's experiences. I've just always been, I really do care about people. I can't turn it off. And that's what brought me to theater initially, and what I realized is like there was a different life that helped me pursue that purpose. And I think in particular, where people could feel their humanity at work, which when I first entered corporate America, I felt like everyone was putting a mask on, and it felt very dehumanizing to me, like as an outsider. And I just felt like, people do this every day on purpose? Like, this feels awful. But then I recognized I could play a part in helping people take off the mask and, you know, connect with each other. So I don't do it through theater anymore. Also, that lifestyle is very hard. I go to bed way too early to be an actor. But anyway, so it's interesting because for a while I didn't talk about theater because I didn't understand the connection. But as I have continued to think about it, and you know, the other piece is though, like I water that part of my garden differently. You know, I take photographs, or I have other creative endeavors, or I do a lot of writing at work through communications with employees and things. So I find other ways to do it. It's a very good question, and one that's been at the center of my becoming, maybe, to ask myself if I evolved too far. But again, I have people that keep it real with me too, where I think if I got off the path, I'd hear about it.
Lindsay, Ashby, thank you so much for being here.